Hello, my name is Luke Miller from San Diego State University, and I'm going to be talking about why and how we use open source hardware and software solutions to monitor the behavior and the physiology of bivalves out in the field. And I want to start by acknowledging a lot of collaborators on these various projects, in particular Wes Dowd from Washington State University, who sort of first got me going down this road of developing data loggers to monitor muscle behavior out in the field, and various funding sources as well. So the general motivations for why we do what we do here is really looking at how environmental variability plays onto these organisms that are often foundation species, things like mussel beds providing habitat for so many other organisms in the intertidal zone, or oyster reefs in bays and estuaries. And how do those organisms deal with changes in temperature and salinity and oxygen availability and so forth? How does that differ between individuals within a reef or within a single bed, over small spatial scales, and also over larger spatial scales? Now, folks have been measuring bivalve behavior and physiology for well over a century at this point. Up in the top middle here, there's a diagram describing a device to measure the opening and closing of clam valves from 1909, using something like one of these chymographs here that was recording the movement of the shells via a little lever arm and a scribe on a smoked rotating drum that gives you a trace, something like this in the bottom left, showing you changes between open and closed in these bivalves through time. There were various versions of this through the time, using other things like rotating chart recorders over in the far right here. My interest in this sort of thing stretches back 2 decades at this point. These are some photos from a presentation we gave in 2002 or 2003 at the SICB meetings, measuring the opening and closing of mussels in the field. You can tell these are the old days because we were using a Palm Pilot to actually download our data loggers there. And in some cases, we're running wires back up to a computer up on the shore to actually monitor these things in real time for long periods of time. In more recent years, then we sort of shrunk things down and made them more durable, made them longer lasting, running on batteries instead of having to provide power from the shore in order to monitor the behavior of groups of mussels. In this case, on the right here, showing a little artificial mussel bed we put together made of a bunch of live mussels, some of which have a bunch of instruments attached to them, things to measure the opening and closing of the valves, the body temperature, the orientation of the shells as well. And so when you've got multiple replicate animals like that and multiple sites, you can start to collect a lot of data. This is just some example data from this experiment with these false mussel beds. So we've got a high shore group here and a low shore group that you can't quite see. And the two graphs in the upper part of the video here are showing the individual valve openings of individual mussels in these groups. So different colors represent in different mussels on the same plate. And you can see at the low shore site in the upper right, they start opening up as the tide starts to submerge them. It takes quite a bit longer later in the day for those high site mussels in the foreground of the picture to start getting splashed and opening up. And then they individually all start to close back down as the tide drops in the afternoon, the high site mussels closing up earlier than our low site mussels. Now, folks have also been doing things like measuring heart rate over the last several decades, initially using things that maybe required drilling holes in the shell in order to measure the electrical signal of the heart actually contracting. In the early 1990s, DePledge and Anderson started off this method of using infrared sensors to actually shine an infrared light through the shell of the organism and pick up the reflected light coming back off of the moving heart, so that you could sort of non-invasively attach a sensor to the outside of the animal, sense what the heart was doing inside, and not have to really disturb the animal quite as badly. And there's been various improvements on this design through time as well. These days, we've sort of got them shrunken down to little sensors that are directly taken from the types of oxygen monitoring devices that the doctor clips on your finger when you go in for a checkup these days. But now we can glue them to the side of the mussel as well and get ourselves a nice little trace of what the mussel's heart rate is and attach that to a data logger. And so what I've shown you in the past couple of slides of the electronic versions, the simple sort of breakdown of all of that is that we've got some sensor that we want to read data from. We want to process that either using a big, desktop or laptop or something like that, or we can shrink it down and use something like a microcontroller that just reads this sensor and takes those data and puts them in memory on some kind of memory card or in a chip that we can later download and process back on dry land. Now, these data loggers tend to share a common set of components. I'll just sort of point out some of them here. So this is a data logger used to measure the temperature, the orientation, and the valve gaping of various muscles. And so we've got various sensors over here on the right-hand side of the board. In the middle is one of those microcontrollers. This one is the same as what you find in an Arduino Uno, which I'll talk about more in a few slides. Costs $1 to $3 depending on how many you want and whether you can get them easily given global supply shortages. There's usually some sort of memory on board, in this case a micro SD card holder. And so that micro SD card can be popped out and stuck into your computer, and the data files can be opened directly from that. You often want some kind of real-time clock so that you can program it with the current date and time, and then the microcontroller can continuously talk to it and ask it, what time is it now? Now that I've just taken a sample, I'm going to write both the time and date and that sample value to the memory card and save that for future use. On these boards, then, I also have serial communications connectors so that I can hook them directly up to a laptop or a desktop and sort of talk to them in real time, and also upload new programs to the microcontroller as well. And this is useful for troubleshooting and prototyping and developing. And there's various other ancillary parts on these boards that I won't get into, but those are sort of the basics. And just in a different form factor here, I'll show you that all of the same parts basically exist as well. And here, different form factor for a different kind of project and different housing size. So why go down the open source route instead of using commercially available data loggers? And there are lots of commercially available data loggers, more and more every year. Well, oftentimes those commercial ones are expensive. You're paying for someone who actually knows what they're doing on the electrical engineering side to build this thing and provide it to you. Oftentimes, commercial data loggers might be sort of inflexible in terms of what types of sensors they might talk to or how quickly they can read or that sort of thing. The amount of memory that they might have, the amount of battery power or length of runtime might be inadequate for your uses or our uses. And so oftentimes that sort of, again, pushes us down that road. But probably the most important thing here is really sort of the cost. And when we're talking about needing to replicate lots and lots of organisms, that potentially means lots and lots of data loggers. And so if you can build them yourself, especially with the relatively cheap labor of a graduate student whose project it is to collect all these data for all these animals, then you can get away with better replication if you're building things yourself. So the burgeoning field of open source hardware and software solutions in the last decade or two has really made this a lot more feasible. So our general workflow then for getting from an idea or a hypothesis that we want to test to actually collecting data is something like what I've got laid out here. And I'll sort of walk through parts of this as we go. But we start out really by needing to define what are the parameters that we want to collect. How often do we want to sample those data? How long do we want this data collection process to run for? What kind of power sources are we going to have available? So what kind of housing to waterproof this thing might we need? And are there appropriate sensors available for us? Oftentimes the answer is yes. It's just a matter of being able to interface with those sensors. So, I might want to measure something like valve gape or heart rate or temperature, and I'll use different sensors for each of those purposes, but interface them with a microcontroller. And then, various power sources might be available. You might use regular alkaline batteries. You might use lithium-ion rechargeable batteries. A solar panel as a power source and backup might be very nice if you want to run for months and months. And sometimes the sort of design parameters are going to be dictated in part by those power needs, and also the need to sort of fit within a certain type of housing or a certain size envelope. So in the picture here, I've just got a little one of these infrared heart rate sensors that we use, sort of identify that as a potential device that I could use to measure heart rate. And then how can I talk to that thing? So that's the next set of steps, and that is really the prototyping phase here. So starting to collect sensors and collect development boards like an Arduino that can interface with those sensors and also save those data. And so this involves both software steps and hardware steps. But really the goal is to take something like one of these Arduino Unos here on the left, or the slightly more powerful Teensy boards on the right, stick those in a breadboard, which is that white plastic thing on the right here, and use that to sort of to wire up connections to our sensors, like the little heart rate sensor that I've got stick on a wire here, talking to this teensy development board. So these sorts of things are generally open source hardware projects and have associated free software with them to be able to program them and run them. And then there's, for the hobbyist market, there's this huge growing list of little sensors and other breakout boards that you can interface with your chosen microcontroller. So I've highlighted here just two vendors, two of which I often use, that make a point of providing open source hardware solutions and a lot of software to go with it for various parts that might be useful, including something like a micro SD card holder that you can then adapt onto your breadboard, various sorts of sensors like thermocouple amplifiers, pressure sensors, that heart rate sensor or pulse oximeter there on the left. And then they also sell these more generic sort of adapter boards that allow you to take the modern tiny surface mount chips, solder them on there, and then have something that you can then plug into a breadboard and test and see, is it going to collect the data like you want it to? Now, once you've sort of identified a set of sensors and a microcontroller and a sort of list of parts that you want to get onto a data logger, you could potentially stop there. If you've got a breadboard that works and some software that collects data, maybe that's enough, and maybe you can go collect data with that. But in my case, oftentimes we want to build a lot of these things and we want them to be fairly robust. And so it's often useful to be able to shrink things down onto a single sole purpose circuit board rather than a bundle of wires on a breadboard. And so at that point, then it's useful to start designing our own circuit board. And again, these days, there's lots of software and tutorials and guides available to sort of show you all of these steps. So two of the software packages that I do use, this KiCad here in the upper left and Eagle in the lower right, both have freeware versions available. And KiCad in particular up there on the left is a completely freeware solution that is an open source solution, which is what I use these days. And Eagle is sort of the old standby that has that freeware version, but also has paid upper tiers as well. So both of these sorts of software suites give you the ability to start laying out electrical schematics and plugging in representations of the individual chips you want to use. So in this case on the left, this is a representation of one of those infrared heart rate sensors. On the right, the very simple representation of a temperature sensor. And then the little green wires here I use to connect off, to basically draw the electrical connections that are necessary to power these chips and also talk to the microcontroller. And on this slide here, I don't want you to actually be able to read anything, but this is sort of the whole schematic, including things like in the center here, the microcontroller chip itself that then has connections going out to all the various peripherals, like our real-time clock, our voltage regulator, our micro SD card, and so forth. So once all of that is laid out, and again, there are plenty of tutorials to show you how to do this, you've got the sort of rule set that's going to define how this thing should be connected electrically. And then you want to develop a circuit board that represents that as well. And so both of those packages, KiCad and Eagle, both have the facility facility then to actually lay out the physical circuit boards. And so this is a representation of one of these data loggers. And so there are footprints in red here, sort of showing where each of these various chips would live. The micro SD card, there's connectors over here on the right for those cables that will run off to sensors and so forth. And so you place all of these within the sort of form factor that you want to define, in this case, a long, narrow board. And then your electrical schematic defines which of these various little footprints needs to be connected to each other with the little red wire traces here. And all of this then is a board layout that you can send off to a board production house. And so there are plenty of places that will run very small batches of custom circuit boards for you. You basically upload your board layout here in the top left, and I tend to use this site, oshpark.com or opensourcehardwarepark.com. They will take that KiCad file directly or that Eagle file directly, create their representation of what your board will look like when they print it. And then about 2 weeks later, you get a copy of these boards. And in this case, you're paying about $1.70 per square inch per individual board, which is not super. There are definitely cheaper places, but that sort of gives you an idea of the cost that you're dealing with. And then at that point, you need to take those bare boards and turn them into assembled boards with the chips that you have purchased from various vendors. And so assembling those prototype circuit boards may seem daunting, and I want to sort of convince you that, it's actually not as bad as you might think. There are various tools that you will need, most of which have relatively affordable versions. A good soldering station, a hot air rework station is useful to stick those chips down and solder them in place. You don't necessarily use old-fashioned soldering wire for surface mount chips. You instead use this solder paste and then stick the whole thing in either a dedicated infrared reflow oven or what is here literally just an old toaster oven that we've modified to do the soldering process for it. And that soldering process is, as I said, maybe a little daunting at first, but really the steps are helped by just being able to get something like this stencil here, this clear plastic stencil that I can then use to spread solder paste onto all of the footprint pads that need it. And at that point, once there's solder paste on them, you can just start dropping your surface mount chips onto it in the next step here. And obviously these parts are small. It's useful to have things like a little stereo dissecting scope that you would typically find around a lab, have a good pair of forceps, and you can place these things on there on that soldering paste. And once you've got all your individual little pieces there set up by the rules in the electrical schematic that you have earlier created, you can put these things together and solder them. And so the next step is put it in the oven, let it heat up for a few minutes, melt that solder. And what you get out then is a bunch of those chips permanently soldered onto your board. And in this case, there's often these other through hole parts that need to be soldered on by hand. And so here I'm using that sort of old-fashioned solder with a soldering iron to attach these extra parts. And that gets you the sort of final completed device. So that you might have those extra steps where you again need that soldering iron, or a hot air rework station might be useful for cleaning up messes, too much solder in some cases. So solder wick and flux are also sort of useful tools at this stage. When we're putting sensors on organisms that are going to go in the water, one of the tricks is, okay, how do you waterproof the actual sensor? And typically they're sitting on the ends of cables. And so adhesive lined heat shrink is really useful in this case. It creates a nice watertight seal once you melt it and it shrinks around. And you can get it in clear versions here with our little infrared sensor contained within that clear heat shrink. And that is a nice permanent seal that will survive for several months in the field. At that point, you've got an assembled prototype circuit board. It's time to sort of write some software to test the individual pieces and then develop and deploy that final data logging program, which in some part is probably a derivation of your original prototyping that you did. And so the Arduino system is what I still use because it's nice free software. It's got a huge variety of freely available libraries that add on features. So for instance, you can go and download a library that allows you to talk to that SD card very simply. You can go download a library that allows you to talk to your real-time clock, and you can sort of paste all of these things together in a language that is effectively just C++ with bits of the original C language in it as well. So if you've programmed in something like R or Python, learning this is not a huge lift. And then you need to house these things to put them out in the field. And so we are typically making use of either commercially available waterproof housings like this. And if you've got to run sensor cables out of those housings, having a cable gland is a very nice, useful thing. And these are available for about $1 a piece. And they do a pretty good job, at least in shallow submersion, of keeping water out of your housing. Other times we're building these housings out of just PVC pipe, literally from the hardware store, because it's a good, robust, cheap, sort of modular sort of housing. So one of those housings here is from our open wave height logger project. We've got a stack of circuit boards here, batteries, all of that is housed within this set of PVC pipes behind it. At the bottom here is another representation of one of those circuit boards where it's designed to actually fit within a little 3/4 inch plumbing pipe here, along with its lithium ion battery and a little plug to have these sensor wires stick out of them. And all of that is designed with the idea that we can shove this relatively small pipe down in the mud and just have an oyster sitting up on the surface where hopefully passersby won't notice it and fool with it while it's out there collecting data. As far as attaching sensors, one of the strengths of using bivalves is they've got that nice hard shell. And so if you do a little, pretend dentistry here and grind off a clean patch of the shell, you can use things like cyanocrylate glue, super glue, to attach those heat shrink covered sensors to them. And then we typically back that up with some 2-part epoxy, the green stuff here on the right, that gives better adhesion and better abrasion resistance and so forth. And so in that case, we can have these sensors survive on the animals for a year or so far in some of our deployments. And then ultimately, you're building stuff on your own rather than buying it from a commercial supplier. And so you really ought to be doing some calibration, both for the commercial stuff, but also especially for things that you've built yourself. And so we will take these and calibrate our temperature sensors in a water bath so we can compare among and to a reference temperature. When we're measuring valve opening and closing, we'll do things like shove a little known diameter peg in between the shell valves and use that as a benchmark for what our voltage is that we're getting off of this sensor. So I'll just finish at this point by pointing you to some resources. Probably my most well-developed one is the Open Wave Height Logger project at owhl.org. There's a paper that sort of runs through the actual project, what it does, how it performs. And then we've provided this website with a whole build guide for all the electronics and also the housings, and including how to program the things. And then we do keep a GitHub project site going with sort of updates occasionally to sort of keep this thing current and working for new users. The muscle tracker project that I referenced briefly at the beginning, that exists as again, a public repository. So you can download the design files for the actual circuit board. You can send them off to be built. You can buy the parts, you can put them on the board yourself, and you can replicate this if you like. And then for measuring valve gate for lots of animals, we've got sort of the 16-channel gate tracking thing that I've shown a few pictures of here with a bunch of oysters that are going out in an estuary. And so this will run for several months on a set of Duracell batteries, D-cell batteries, and just sort of collect data on valve gate every second or every 5 seconds as frequently as you want. So I'll just finish off with this list of places that or programs and websites that I've referenced already in this talk, and I will wrap up. Thank you very much.